On Tuesday, Kevin Warsh, Trump's Fed chair nominee, sat in front of the Senate confirmation hearing. He was grilled for a few hours, and what came out of it was a blueprint, a vision that, if implemented, could really pose a genuine catastrophic risk to the current business cycle. But to be fair, it could play out maybe a bit more benign. It's all going to really come down to one variable alone. And by the end of this video, you're going to know exactly what to keep an eye on. But to get there, we're going to break down what I see as kind of the two pillars of his plan. Pillar number one, redo the Fed's balance sheet, roll off the mortgage-backed securities, the MBS portion of the portfolio, shrink the Fed's footprint. And number two, lower rates, because in Warsh's mind, these are offsetting moves that together, if done, will produce some sort of better outcome for the economy. But this is where the problem lies. I think the Fed, Warsh, they really have these levers backwards in terms of what they're going to do mechanically. And it's because of that we could really be on a path in which Warsh's Fed just drives this economy off a cliff. But again, there is a possible way out. But before we get into the details tonight, if you are new here, make sure you hit subscribe, turn that notification bell on so you won't miss anything going forward. And if you're an active trader, active investor, make sure you check out appliedmmt.com. That's where you're going to get my in-depth research and analysis, all the macro tools, all the forecasting models each week, the big updates. And tonight, I do have a big update dropping that you're not going to want to miss. So check that out. All right. So we're going to do this. We're going to break things down in 3 steps here. Step number 1, we're going to go over what Warsh's goals actually are. Step number 2 is going to be how I see the levers actually working with regards to his 2 goals and why I think the Fed, Warsh, has it backwards. Step number 3 is how we end up in a not so good place if we see some missteps with how Warsh's plan ends up getting implemented. So what is Warsh's plan? 2 pillars here, like we said. Pillar number 1 is quantitative tightening, QT, which is to allow the mortgage-backed securities that are currently on the Fed's balance sheet to get sold back to the private sector or roll off the balance sheet. The idea here from the Fed's perspective is quite simple, that is going to be a headwind. It's going to be deflationary or disinflationary to growth. The reason is because in their mind, loanable funds, the more reserves that are out in the private sector, the more likely the banking sector is going to want to create loans. Again, we'll debunk that thoroughly, but that's the idea. And by swapping that out, by forcing the private sector to have these mortgage-backed securities, they're going to be less likely to lend. Idea number 2 here then, or to go along with that, is to run a kind of reverse move, which would, in their mind, be more inflationary, which is to do rate cuts, right? Now, this is a little bit easier to follow. Lower rates, lower borrowing cost, that just increases the impetus to borrow, and you end up getting more borrowing, more business activity. But there's a lender to every borrower. I think the Fed's missing that. However, in their mind, rate cuts, inflationary, deflationary, disinflationary. Ultimately, what ends up happening is the Fed has a smaller footprint in the financial sector as a whole, and hopefully that spurs on more economic growth and gets us into some sort of better economic outcome. Now, step number 2 here, though, and just for us to just disagree. Idea number 1, QT, definitely not deflationary. Okay, let's dive into this a little bit and try and explain why it is QT is not in any way deflationary. It all has to do with, if you think of the banking sector, or even the financial sector as a whole, as one massive portfolio of assets. At the bottom of that portfolio, the most important part of that portfolio is going to be safe assets. And it's from that safe asset core that the rest of the entire portfolio can build from. And in order to get the kind of max amount of leverage, the most amount of lending, the most amount of financial activity to occur off that safe asset base, you're going to want the highest yield possible off that safe asset base. In other words, if you construct a portfolio and the safest of assets that you have in that portfolio have a relatively high yield and still remain safe, then you're able to use the rest of the money you have in that portfolio to go after riskier assets. And in this case, the riskiest of assets are going to be loans to very risky borrowers, right? To high risk business opportunities, buying equities in high risk business, right? Those are going to be your riskiest of assets that you can hope for the best return from, but they're going to have a high risk profile. The safest of assets, which would be things like treasuries, and you could maybe even put kind of alternatives in that basket like mortgage-backed securities. If those things are able to yield a relatively high return and the financial sector is able to hold them, then you can build upon that with these riskier assets. So what my point is in all of this is really what you're seeing is a recomposition of assets that are outstanding. What's not happening here is the money supply as is, the money available to buy these assets isn't changing. You're just getting a composition change. And the Fed thinks that this money supply could potentially increase or thinks that they're getting some sort of wealth effect that spurs this on, but really they're not because they're working against their own interest by allowing reserves that are going to be the lowest yielding, although they're safe, being the lowest yielding asset to come out of the private sector and now go back into the Fed and allow the mortgage-backed securities to get onto the balance sheet of the financial sector. What's going to happen is you're going to get a higher yielding aspect, a higher yielding, more abundant, safe assets in the private sector, which means the rest of the asset pool is going to be able to grow in its valuation relative to the total amount of money that is out there. And here's the second thing. The money supply grows when business activity is taking place, and business activity takes place when there is a comfortability there's a return available for the private sector to make riskier and riskier loans, to take riskier and riskier bets on assets. And so that part of it allows the money supply to grow. And as that money supply grows, whether endogenously or exogenously via, new government spending or just the new loan creation that we talked about, as that money supply grows, more and more of that money can continue to go to riskier assets. Why? Because you get a higher yield on those now abundant, safe assets that take up a smaller and smaller part of the overall pie as the money supply grows. So as I see it, definitely not deflationary here. If anything, definitely going to be inflationary if this ends up playing out in terms of, or at least pro-growth overall. Honestly, I'm actually good overall with Warsh's idea of getting the balance sheet runoff of the mortgage-backed securities. The private sector is going to want those back anyway. So QT, not deflationary. Now let's go on to QE. And here's the idea with QE. What rates are really doing is they're just picking who the winners and losers are going to be. It's a recomposition of who is going to get the income and who's going to pay the income at any given point of the business cycle. Now, there is the aspect that is absolutely true. When you get a rate cut, that is going to help borrowers, right? Without a doubt, borrowers and those who are income constrained are going to be helped by rate cuts. It's just going to make borrowing cheaper. However, it also means those creating the loans are just going to get less income from those loans. And if you're going to get less income from those loans, you might not be as incentivized to create that loan. So you could end up creating fewer loans because of lower rates. So there is a give and take in this. The other thing too, and if we just look at this from the flip side as well, when rate hikes happen, and this is why we can oftentimes see a high rate environment lead to higher rates of inflation or just an overall more expanding economy or more expanding amount of bank loans being created, is because those who are income setters, and in this instance, I'm thinking of businesses who have the capacity to pass along the increased costs, the borrowing cost to the consumer. I would call that an income setter. They have the capacity to go ahead and do that, and that can be supported. Why? Because when rates get pushed higher, that means definitionally the money supply has to be growing. Why? Because the Fed pays interest on those bonds right back to the private sector, and so the money supply exogenously is being increased, which means the money is being added to support that higher price that has to get passed through from the income setter. So the income setter gets to expand, gets to take up more of that money supply, and you end up actually seeing the rate hike not crash markets or not crash the business cycle or cause disinflation. You can actually see it be inflationary. You can see it be pro-growth. Now, I will say rate cuts, one part that this absolutely does help, and one segment, one sector of the private sector as a whole that this will, is help out those who are income constrained, particularly in the mortgage space and particularly wage earners, right? What a wage earner can't do in a rate hike scenario is go to their boss and say, hey, I need a raise to match the rate hike because I want to get a mortgage and that cost is now being incurred for me. It's not going to work as fast that way. It takes time for that additional interest income to finally make its way into the income earner to go ahead and get that raise to now offset the higher borrowing costs. So you do see cuts helping things like the housing sector that is predominantly supported by income constrained borrowers. So I'm going to call QE/QT a bit of a wash here I'm going to call rate hikes a bit of a wash here, with rate cuts potentially serving as maybe more of a deflationary or lower growth sort of environment. And of course, empirically, that is exactly what did play out during the post-Great Financial Crisis period. I'm going to look at a couple charts here just to kind of show this out. Look, prior to the Great Financial Crisis, every single credit cycle in terms of loan growth made it over 10%, some up to 15% year-over-year growth in terms of loan expansion. It was only during that 15 years after the Great Financial Crisis that we never saw credit growth, except for just a few quarters, get over 5% year-over-year growth in terms of credit expansion. We saw very lackluster credit expansion. And again, I think it was twofold. One, we saw very little incentive for the lender to loan because of low rates. And two, the massive expansion of QE of the balance sheet of the Fed took the safe assets, the high-yielding safe assets out of the private sector and put those on the Fed's balance sheet. So kind of point number one here is, and evidence number one, loan growth at its lowest level ever for about 15 years under QE, under ZIRP. And we didn't see that change until we went into the massive expansion post-COVID. And then number two, same thing on the inflation front. Consistently, the Fed's target always been 2%, consistently above that 2% zone, going all the way back to kind of post-Volcker till the Great Financial Crisis period when we had relatively high rates. Once you get into ZIRP and QE, we almost never make it above the target rate of 2%. It was very hard for inflation to ever stay above 2% again, for the reasons that we just talked about, that the large balance sheet, QE, and low rates are not the inflationary tool that central bankers like to think. And again, it wasn't until COVID and the huge spike that we saw in oil in 2022 that really kicked off the inflation cycle that we saw during the post-COVID era. So empirically, what we saw was definitely QE and quantitative easing and low rates create a very low inflation, low growth environment. And this leads us to where the biggest risk is with the current plan that Warsh has, and that is currently what's really supporting the macro cycle has been the interest income that generated from the massive rate hike cycle that we saw. Right now, as it stands, we're at about 1.2 trillion yearly in terms of interest income that the Fed or that the federal government, the Treasury, is paying on the interest on the total bonds that are outstanding. And the reason this number, one, is just striking, but is important, if you actually look at the current deficit that we are at right now, you're running about a $1.7, $1.8 trillion deficit annually. So the vast majority of the deficit right now is being made up of just this interest income. And if we get rid of this interest income, in other words, if rate cuts are very dramatic here and they come first, I think we could see a spot where fiscal spending begins to decelerate dramatically. And of course, every time we get a dramatic deceleration, a dramatic slowing of fiscal, a dramatic slowing of that money supply into the private sector, that is where the crisis can come from, right? It's when the influx of money, the two pathways money can get to the private sector, if they shrink the money supply, then all of a sudden you get a force shrinking of the assets that are on the balance sheets of that financial sector, and that is where you can become, essentially the balance sheet of the private sector becomes insolvent. There's just not enough money to actually meet the claims that are on the balance sheets, and that's when the system can collapse, when the valuation of the assets that are in there all have to collapse. That is the calamity. And I would say that because fiscal spending right now, which is one of the engines in which the money supply can expand with, would be at direct attack in rate cuts. And we are going to be getting by the end of 2026 pretty darn close to a tipping point, especially if inflation keeps pushing higher here, where fiscal spending could really be a headwind, and lower rates here, if they're done fast enough, quick enough, and steep enough, could really hit the key channel here to the main growth engine that we've seen over the past 3-4 years of the current business cycle. And that is where I think we need to be paying close attention to, and I want you to watch, is if Warsh gets in, he starts cutting rates, what it does to fiscal spending. Because if fiscal spending collapses, then this economy is going off a cliff. However, like I said, there is a pathway in which I think we can end up with a soft landing. If we only get, say, 75, 100 basis points worth of cuts over the next year or two, the credit cycle continues on its current path, we get ample fiscal spending, then we're in the clear until we see the flip of fiscal spending. But at that point, we need to be worried. And I do think that what we're seeing with Warsh's plan, we could end up getting to the tipping point sooner rather than later.